Let's do this.
We are, as always, playing Street Fighter 5. It's Monday, so that's how it goes. Good evening, everyone! Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. We are, as always, playing Street Fighter 5. That's what we do on Mondays, so join us in our 3 rounds. First 2, character select off, East Coast lobby. Today our focus across all players will probably be learning not to waste your motion, not getting stressed out. And for that reason, we expect to see more matches between team members, since you can practice this without specifically fighting new people. When you're fighting your teammates or friends, you could walk and get into bad habits, but since part of this is consciously stopping yourself from doing it, this is somewhat the easier version of making sure that you don't. Why add the additional stress of fighting someone you don't understand, possibly with a character you don't understand, when you haven't even started really yet? Of course, choosing which button to use is just as important. But that's something we've been seeing people build up over time for a while now. Most team members have a clear enough idea of what they want to hit, but lose their opportunities because of doing too many other things, or seeking a way to open up an opponent who might, given just half a second, do something that causes them to be vulnerable on their own. This is in fact something you can train against with our bots. It's just very specific bots, and it's not the common ones that we suggest to people. Now that we have Championship Edition available, it changes at least a little bit, because you're more likely to be able to get easier access to the bots where it's a good idea to do this sort of training. But most of us did actually have that option before, since one of the main ones for it is just Boxer. Still, we're gonna be a little quieter today, as noted, too. More so spend time watching and see when a particular movement was probably less necessary.
Final round. Fight. You win.
Becoming calmer in this way does help with scrambles, but not a lot. Scrambles are a different aspect of brain conditioning.
Round 1.
What this will help you do is avoid becoming so stressed that you freeze up in the moment of the scramble, but that does not make you more likely to make the correct decision. It does help with things you have practiced at least a little bit before though.
Round 2. Fight. Win.
Learning to hold a state for an entire match is something you quickly find yourself needing to do if you either intend to rank up past gold, which doesn't really apply to any of the content we normally do, but does apply when gold players join your lounges.
Let's do this.
And when you go to nearly any tournament, because the sort of person who is willing to enter a tournament may not actually be gold, but they've definitely got the same sort of mindset. They're specifically aiming to get a certain effect on the opposing player almost all of the time. Usually it's a matter of dedication, but the point is that most people who go to tournaments aren't going to run into that situation you see sometimes, or that we talk about sometimes, with the opponent who loses their nerve and just runs away from you for 20 seconds at a time. Without a plan, specifically, or with a very weak plan that they're just hoping you can't counter. This is not generally the sort of battle style you see at tournaments, or if you do, you see it for one person, because the next person, if you do win, isn't likely to have the same flow. This is another match where it's relatively important for Kami to not waste her motion, but it's not necessarily that important that she defends all that well. Kami really can just beat Seth without having particularly good defense. But she does not do it well when she fails her own offense, because Seth tends to take advantage of this very quickly and tends to convert into big damage very fast. This is very slightly laggy, but not the type of lag, okay, then I take that back. It was not the type of lag that tends to cause big problems. At this point though, we could still say that this is really not being lag decided.
Round 2. Fight.
This is much more heavily decided by decision making and being flustered. generally one of the things we suggest when fighting against any character that you're not familiar with is to just assume that they're not very strong. Aside from pressure, almost every character, someone will find a way to make the pressure work, and therefore you shouldn't assume you can mash out of it. But if you overall assume that the character isn't strong, what often happens is that when people do mix-ups or try to mess you up, you don't lose focus on what you were trying to do, and that means you don't often lose your own spacing as easily. This also helps us to get used to the idea that the opponent is sometimes landing hits without doing a lot of damage, and it's really important to deal with that in most of the new characters this game has. Seth and Gil mostly don't do a lot of damage until they get to a specific point, or unless you make a certain type of mistake and basically let them. A lot of what this player, for example, is doing has more so to do with feelings that are being induced than anything specifically difficult about the matchup.
Round 2. Fight.
But Seth's explosive damage toward the end does in fact take the win. Make sure you understand when a character is going to become dangerous through their trigger, and if you can work it out, what precisely the requirement for that is going to be. Some characters don't have a lot of good ways to get their V-trigger going, and while they could use it to hit you, they might not do a lot of damage in the first place.
Let's do this. Round 1. Fight!
Duel has not yet had any time with Sethbot, which is unfortunate because this character is absolutely the type that pushes on everything he does wrong in this game. This does not mean this is necessarily going to be a blow-up, but one might as well expect one.
Round 2.
Given the general flows, Alex uses armor, he uses aerial moves, he doesn't do that well when the opponent can uppercut, and he doesn't guard his feet all that well when he's normally functioning. Seth is incredibly good at taking advantage of all of these things while getting to just keep on hitting buttons. If Alex gets pinned down before he can activate his V-trigger, therefore, stressful things happen. And unlike most characters where Seth just absorbs something that moves him forward, what he gets from Alex is actually fairly powerful for this matchup, in that he can use the Tandem engine to do Stomp, and this is without charge, so he can just do it anytime he wants to.
Round 1.
He seems to use a quicker version, or a, if not quicker version, one that Alex doesn't normally see the point in using or something. Meaning that overall, Seth's flow in this matchup is advantaged relative to Alex fairly heavily. V-reversing him off does help a little bit, but that's not the key of what needs to happen to make this work. The Alex player would have to learn how to bait Seth into doing specific things, and then counter those things with strange and fabulous Alex hit and hurt boxes. But this involves a lot of understanding of spacing.
Looks like you could use more training.
Round 2.
Meaning that in a situation where you're going up against a player who has more experience, you're likely to lose simply because their understanding of spacing is likely to be better than yours. Not a matchup for the faint of heart. Beyond that though, we do have a specific problem faced by DeWolf himself, namely the difficulty in anti-airing. Seth is absolutely a character who will manage the jump in a lot of the time. It's been a while since we designed a bot where the idea of needing to anti-air it was such a critical part of the matchup. But the ability to change jump arc at nearly any time, basically dive kick, in conjunction with a good cross-up and a good long-range zoning jump, means that this is probably the most you have to care how to anti-air bot since Kage. And obviously the lag is not helping. But this is the same we were discussing before. There is a certain amount of wasted motion involved in hitting someone who is likely to jump, rather than moving to the position where the anti-air would be easiest.
Alex wins.
In general, unless the better anti-air position is also somehow your worst standing or spacing position, against jumpy or stressful opponents, you should absolutely move to that position as soon as you get into a confusing situation. Your opponent is likely to jump, and it's best to be able to anti-air. A lot of us get tempted to play footsies, but jumping is basically intended entirely to beat footsies. As you're quickly seeing here, every time the wolf wants to hit a button, the easy answer to the opponent is to jump. If the opponent moves out of the range, but he still has the same focus, then it means that you still run into the same problem. There's no way to be ready to anti-air in time. If your focus is on playing footsies, even when the character can't actually play footsies in any threatening way with you.
Round 2.
Our general idea is that Seth is not the greatest footsies character, and therefore you don't need to spend a lot of time thinking about it. Even the long-reaching stand medium kick is not really that much of a threat. But you do have to use specialized anti-airs. This is often true in this game. There are a lot of characters and a lot of situations where you have to use different anti-airs for this character's jumps, and they're aiming to stress you out. But normally, there are only two characters in the game really that get to play good footsies enough to distract you from that and still jump. Namely, Chun-Li and Cammy. Even Karine cannot technically do it. Her jumps are not good enough. How big a conversion is this? Will the lag cause it to drop? Oh, they use the other one.
Seth wins.
Perfectly played by our Seth guest. Because until your opponent chooses to focus on the jump enough to discourage you, not even proves that they can anti-air. Because anti-airing you once is not proof that they can anti-air. This is entirely about changing their mindset to the point where you know they're going to anti-air, and therefore you must do something. But with characters like Seth and Ken, and to some extent Gil and Kage, a lot of what those characters aim to do is simply keep you distracted long enough with things that are supposed to look like footsies or ground game that they will eventually overload you to the point where they can jump. In general, their ground game is not so threatening that you even care, meaning that if you can anti-air them and can keep your mind on the anti-air while still managing at least a decent amount of footsies, the jump never works, and therefore they don't get much advantage. We know for sure, though, that the president, assuming this isn't super laggy, might be, is a person who anti-airs nearly everything, so I'm not expecting a lot of problem here. He also knows when to not anti-air, so even with the requirement of specific anti-airs that Seth gives, you are going to mostly see stuff like this. Yes, there is a point where he gets hit by Seth doing things that look like footsies, but the damage is never that critical. How many times would Seth need to hit with that crouch heavy punch? Making it worse, that move is fairly minus even when you do it correctly, and G is an explosive character, so there's no good way to deal with this. Seems actually less laggy this time. But maybe not, given that input.
Round 2. Fight.
One thing that does make this difficult for G is that Seth's range makes it difficult to build up presidentiality quickly. It is often important actually to use opportunities to get this build up, because while Seth does have a couple of good knockdowns and he can usually access them fairly quickly, he's more so the character type that you could beat up in neutral if you had enough additional ways of doing it. as we know though, the president doesn't really use many bots. And possibly hasn't had time to get around to them anyway. Even if they were going to start. So,
Seth wins.
it doesn't look like it was that laggy though. We'll probably find out, because if it was terrible there would just be no rematch. Oh, here we go.
Round one. Fight.
Well, why is therefore? The question is, when can the president find the time to get more presidentiality and keep it? Because getting it means that Seth gets at least a chance to get into position. Once Seth gets a chance to get into position, he does have enough ways of making sure that he will get a knockdown, even if not a good one. That it can be concerning.
Not my day!
Round two. Fight.
One thing that could change here, from either side, is what actually is played at the longer ranges. The President is used to throwing out G-burst projectile in order to prevent certain things from happening in neutral. But Seth isn't really a character where this tends to be too necessary. If Seth wasn't in position to begin with, you can mostly ignore it.
Final round. Fight.
Light it up. I have the power of light.
G wins. Round one.
The application of the netcode patch across the board is likely to cause this same sort of thing to happen, even when you don't have the same flaw in the code from the original mod that we've heard about anyway. We've heard it referred to as a flaw. It does seem likely that the situation will degrade over time depending on either distance or flow. That said, while it is stuttery and somewhat jumpy, if you're used to this sort of flow in games, let's say you've been playing on things like, what was that even called? Super Arcade, that was it.
Not my day.
This type of lag is a little more well understood. The suddenly stop entirely because it needs to resync and fell completely out. One thing that you will get used to though, that as frustrating as it becomes, is the idea that unless the lag hit you at one of the worst moments where your opponent was in the middle of a pressure string or something, the one-sided rollback now is a synchronization ping, meaning that if you were in position and the screen froze, even if it freezes entirely, whatever is happening on the screen will be what is happening when it unfreezes. Whereas before, we had the problem of one person's system proceeding onward and the others
Not my day.
not, and then having to be rubber banded forward. By that time you're already being hit. Everything we've seen so far indicates that once you do get hit, even if you're in the middle of taking damage from a specific move, if the game has to stop and resync, it will stop, it will resync from the point where it did stop, and you will see the rest of the move play out. This doesn't really help you when you have to make tough decisions in scrambles, but it's definitely something.
Let's do this.
Good old Gutsman theme. I think it was Gutsman theme. You think I know better because I have this game and I play this game? But obviously Robot Master themes are interesting. We did discuss this one a little last week. Nikali is probably better suited to anti-airing Seth and staying out of his way than most characters. You don't want people to get too close, but Nikali is very capable of fighting from far away if he needs to. So in the end it comes down to being prepared for the anti-air, more so than physically being set up to anti-air. In other words, Seth can't get to the position to do enough of his crazier jumps, meaning that Nikali gets some reprieve compared to most characters. As we've often classified players though, Jess Inns is, and has always been, since I believe they've been in this line before, a close-in player, meaning that your expectation of what's going to happen at any given point should be that they will try to find a way to get closer to you. It's a good sign for this flow though, because if your opponent's intent is to get closer to you, you don't have to try to get closer to them as much, you just have to be ready for whatever they're going to do. This means put them wherever you need them to be, and trust in your skill to keep the situation under control. And if you feel as if you can't trust in your skill to keep the situation under control, then ask yourself, really, why is that? What are you doing as your primary aim in the match? Because if you are just going ham because you don't feel as if your opponent can be stopped, it's a good chance that you're not getting any better. Of course, one could make the conscious decision, I just want to beat this person and I'll train that later. But it's not often that helpful to do. As we discussed relative to Seth last week,
Seth wins.
it is not sufficient to think of Seth stealing your move as something that you could just assume is like the mirror match. Seth has entirely different options than your character. probably the only character in the game who should look at Seth absorbing their move and go, oh, it's fine, it's the same thing, is probably Urian. I guess G sort of can. But for everyone else, the spaces Seth is able to occupy, the jumps, the ranges, the uppercut, even Nakali, this guidance, one of the easiest to understand moves in the game, still faces a slightly different situation when Seth is using it. Specifically because Seth is able to pull you in from around the same range he would want to do it, meaning you have to consider whether or not he's coming at you or not. You can't just say, I'm going to block, because he will get some advantages out of you standing one place and blocking so that you don't get hit with this guidance and so that you can punish it. Nakali doesn't really give you that same problem.
Round 2. Fight.
Against most Nakali, if they are playing from far out, they don't have a way to really bother you or set up a jump that is devastating, even with the dive kick. But Seth can make the change to the spacing without doing the dash. He does this of his volition. If Seth wants you closer, and you are close enough to start with, then you're going to come closer. Whether or not this is a good idea or not is different depending on the matchup, but overall, bear it in mind. If you have a character like Nakali who generally must play within a certain range and has one move to close distance, it's one thing. But Seth, who has better cross-ups, more ambiguous jumps, and a literal draw in V-skill, is a lot more dangerous. One also can't afford to just let Seth do too much of that in neutral, even if you continually get away from it, because like almost all activations of V skills, you get V meter for trying.
Seth wins. It's go time.
But it looks like they're had enough of that, and we're going back to the usual.
Let's do this. two. Fight! You lose. Round one. Fight!
The 1 to 2 frame jitters that we're now seeing made the game actually feel and look a lot smoother, closer to, in most people's opinion, playing offline, except that it looks jittery. And it's not even like a terrible type of jittery either, it's more so a, oh, I can clearly see what my opponent was doing, and if you're fast enough your mind will adapt back to it. It can be unfortunate if the game fails to do this synchronization until near the end of the animation of a move, particularly a move that has multiple ways to be ended, or different spacings that can be used by the player because it's controllable. But the other big limit is for those few people who can and do whiff punish things, based more so on seeing the start of the move than the actual outcome of the move.
Final round. Fight!
But that's the horror we face when you play offline. Sorry, when you play online and you do not have to deal with all of the things that go with it anymore, but they're still there. But at the end of the day, as it was pointed out, you can't do that much about it. The speed of light is a thing. And there's always some amount of calculation that must happen.
You win! Round one. Fight!
It's definitely not something that comes up in life that much. But the speed of light is 300,000 kilometers a second. So, oh, that's really fast. But then it's 300 kilometers per millisecond. And suddenly, not so great. Still, frames are much longer than that, so most of the issue has to do with synchronization. Getting this to not stress you out or affect you seems to be more so a matter of the way a person's mind works. Some people can get used to it and play online in all sorts of weird conditions, and some people just can't stand it. A lot of the time this has to do more so with what their character is required to do in the game. But even then, sometimes it's just not your style sometimes. You can't always refocus when it does get jittery. And if you're that type, depending on where you live, the only thing one can offer is bots, really. And of course, whatever locals you can manage to go to.
You lose. Let's do this. Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight.
This is one of those matchups that absolutely comes down to how much motion the Akuma player wastes in any specific way. Akuma has lots of options against almost everything Alex wants to do. And if he's on point, it's difficult for Alex to truly break his defense. Alex players generally work fairly hard to do this, with their balance being simply the fact that Akuma is easier to squash than most people once you actually get going.
Final round. Fight.
That in itself helps to contribute to the way that this match tends to go. The more effort Akuma wastes, combined with the more time that Alex spends with the life lead, the more stressful it becomes for the Akuma player. And honestly, a lot of the time this match comes down to how stressed is the Akuma, rather than anything relative to the character matchup. How much health have I lost? How close am I to being stunned? This sort of thing. Yes, exactly that sort of thing. The situation has gotten worse for me and therefore I have felt the need to take this particular action. And because Alex players know exactly when they've managed to stress people out, almost instinctively, that situation comes up a lot. This match is therefore
Round 1.
a balance, a seesaw. When Akuma is stressed out, Alex doesn't have to think that much, just plays, does Alex things, a little bit ready, hope for the best. When Akuma's not stressed out, then Alex is, because he now has to work extremely hard to have basically anything happen. And the deciding factor in that case, since Alex really doesn't waste a lot of motion as a character in general, he can't afford to, his moves are too slow. The deciding factor of that is almost always, did Akuma waste motion or make an incorrect decision relative to motion or resources? There are of course those moments where one person just guesses right and the other one has to suffer, but while these are naturally part of the game's flow, it's the number of these things happening in any given round that tends to make the decision. This is compounded by the fact that Akuma doesn't mostly want to play footsies with Alex for very long. Alex's footsies are superior, and his sweep has good range, for example, to the point where technically it's unpunishable at max range by Akuma for most situations. And even if he did decide he was going to go in for big damage, Alex is definitely the sort of character who will just be reversal you off because the rest of his playstyle doesn't rely on big V-trigger comebacks.
Looks like I won.
Final round.
The problem with this is that it's somewhat discouraging, in the sense that the better you get at this matchup as Akuma, the more obvious it is when you've lost because you made an incorrect decision. I mean, sometimes you lose because your opponent makes a really weird decision, but a lot of the time, it's looking at the fight and going, why did I do that? Alex is not a heavy pressure character in the first place. He is also a charge character, so you can most of the time see what his status is, especially if he's not trying to play footsies with you at the time. Leaving with the somewhat unfortunate feeling that every time you get countered, you really could have just not. But Duels appears to be out of practice in guiding the trajectory of grabs. Or maybe he's trying to catch backdashes that aren't happening. So in this case, Sindir is able to poke him out of the current flow.
Round 1. Fight.
This is something we've definitely been discussing in multiple games so far. It's been coming up more and more in Unist, and absolutely coming up in Dragon Ball FighterZ, because that's mostly how Dragon Ball FighterZ works at our level of play. Technically it's how it works at nearly every level of play, but in other levels you die much faster as a result of it because the combos are longer. And you need more ideas of how to defend against wake up pressure than you do when you're a beginner and not bothering to learn it. Fortunately for Akuma, Alex is not that good at building up V-meter in this matchup, so he doesn't tend to get a whole lot of your reversals off. Nor does crush counter happen a ton here.
Round 2. Fight!
You can't escape! God, run! Looks like I won. Alright.
Final round. Fight!
Got it! Hey!
Alex wins. Let's do this.
In this matchup, it's actually Alex that needs to spend a lot more time focusing on whether or not he's going to be wasting his energy. This is because G is only really open when he thinks he needs to keep Alex out. But Alex doesn't have a whole lot of threatening ways to get in, meaning that G doesn't generally do a lot. There is a spacing for this though, and one that makes the game feel a lot like regular people fighting Dhalsim, to be honest. There is a point at which Alex needs to stop going forward and go back a little bit, enough to make a specific type of jump. While G is good at anti-airing, there is a spacing at which Alex can get G to miss the anti-air.
Round 1.
And, unlike characters like Seth, Alex benefits from this outright. So whereas the normal feeling is I should walk in on this character, Alex benefits more from just jumping from farther away, where he doesn't have to deal with the G burst or the wheel kick. Actually, if G is really prepared for the jump, the wheel kick may stop Alex's approach, but the wheel kick is not what G wants to do when Alex is occasionally dashing as well, because it puts him too close, and you don't really want to be that close. Until, of course, you have some presidential advantage. One of Alex's bigger stressors in this matchup, however, is the fact that nearly all of his ways of getting damage on G don't do anything against presidentiality at all. He's great at poking and footsies, he can get the head grab, but for various reasons, the stomp is harder to get. And G is not a character that gets crush countered a lot or swept a lot. But that moment right there that you just saw is the best Alex moment possible. You have to do your best not to make it too telegraphed, but it can be difficult to do that as well. Alex doesn't have any moves that move him backward, or moves that stick out a hitbox or hurtbox in the way that you'd think it does. And then misleads the player into thinking that a certain thing has happened. G's best bet? Just corner Alex as quickly as possible, because this removes the capacity for Alex to use his little shimmy backward to set up the jump the way he wants it.
G wins.
Fortunately, G is a character with a lot of corner carry, and even though he doesn't have a lot of it without meter, it does inform you to some extent how you should try to play the match if you have the option. Just use the meter to get Alex close to the corner so that he can't do any tricky jumps.
Fight.
At which point you have a lot of control. When spaced absolutely perfectly, this jump from Alex will even cause G's stand medium kick, following up to whiff, barely. And any Zangief players know exactly how this works. If you can get the player to whiff that kick, you can do all sorts of things. From Alex's perspective, once he's in the corner like this and can no longer set up the jump, then he needs to use his meter. He needs to set up a scenario for himself to get out of there as quickly as possible, so that he can now try to do it again. I have no idea if that was a flash moment of lag or not.
Looks like I won. Alright.
Round 2. Fight.
Neutral jumps do help at closer ranges if you happen to be in one and don't know what else to do. Because while G can absolutely hit Alex in those positions, and can even air-to-air him, this isn't the game G is generally thinking about playing. And as we noted before, overloading your opponent in terms of what they can and cannot do is extremely important for all of these things. The rest is more or less a matter of clarity and scrambles. But there's the use of the meter all the way to the corner. Our Alex does choose a good timing to use his own meter to get back out, but that's just the interaction you should expect from the beginning. G will attempt to corner Alex, preferably early on, or just to make him use the meter so that G can do it again.
Alex wins.
Like all such advice, you can easily find a way to modify it, or matches and situations where the opponent is so far ascended beyond that particular style of play that they have an entirely different plan. A whole new way of dealing with the matchup that you don't necessarily understand. But part of the issue with this is that it's always possible to fall back on these plans. We put these into our notes as what we call the level 1 and level 2 plans, because even if your opponent completely ignores them, you can't discount the fact that they exist, simply because you have to deal with everything that happens as a result. From G's side, as you just saw, for example, he has to care whether or not Alex will trade when he jumps in. And while Alex can't always convert heavily from the jumps if he does the heavy kick, that's not really the point. This therefore is a good G position. Alex can't do anything tricky in terms of air movement, he gets anti-air too easily, but now he's out, I guess. G being cornered is actually oddly a good time for Alex to jump. But the neutral jump becomes more important.
Round 2. Fight.
Because these things are meant to be mixed in with Alex's dashes. Dashes that are not generally fast enough, even against a character like G who doesn't confirm all that well. They're not fast enough to be a threat directly. Getting the opponent to do something else first is where the dash helps. Meaning that a lot of this is about making G do something that you can react to by dashing. Fortunately, G has really slow moves as a generality, and you absolutely can learn the timing for dashing into the late active frames of such moves and removing your problem. But we have meter on both sides now, so let's see what happens.
Looks like I won.
Final round. Fight.
One additional helpful point here is the fact that once Alex is doing this, setting up the jump, his walking back can also be used as the charge for slash elbow, or just to give the opponent the impression that you intend to use slash elbow. Against G in particular, if you don't want to walk back, or if you're already feeling like your positioning is good, and you don't want to walk all the way out, using your flash chop is a good option simply because the opponent can't afford to move forward.
G wins. Let's do this.
Necalli actually faces very similar issues in this matchup, but he does have an advantage. Necalli can jump from closer with the intent of whiffing his dive kick. If G does nothing, then the situation shifts very quickly. Specifically, that means that in order to hold this back, it means that Necalli should also be able to jump at similar ranges with a deep jump heavy kick, what we call jump in crush, hitting the heavy kick at the last moment, because if he doesn't hit it, then the anti-air becomes difficult. G should adapt to this primarily by using wheel kick for nearly everything. There's no harm in it in this matchup under normal circumstances, so just use it all the time, basically. This is because this guidance damage is not enough under most circumstances, nor is the knockdown advantageous enough to Necalli, especially mid-screen, that G cares if he gets hit for doing wheel kick or not. A player with the defensive skills of 46 President can manipulate even more from this without any real worry at all. And in so doing, slowly corner the beast. While Necalli's options are not strictly speaking heavily limited by G's flow or playstyle, without the jump and without the timing for the jump, he must rely on mid-screen stomp, which G counters basically by just hitting V skill and waiting. Even one step forward from Necalli means that he will not be able to do the whiff punish of G's V skill with this guidance anyway, so what really is there to worry about? Simply put, G never has any reason to fight from close enough for Necalli to do anything without at least considering the jump. If there's one saving grace for Necalli in this matchup is that Necalli is not a character that cares a lot how much presidentiality G has. It does interrupt a few things he does, but not enough that you'd think, oh, this is going to ruin my game. And even when it does, Necalli's got 1,000 health, he's not that squishy.
Necalli wins. Round one. Fight.
Keeping the pressure on is therefore important in this matchup for the President as well. He moves people backward in order to prevent Necalli from getting much use out of V trigger once it's active. It also helps that Necalli, while he does have a lot of good scenarios in which to activate his V trigger, they mostly come up in situations where the offense playing player has made some mistake. So you can at least say, okay, I know that as long as I don't mess up too much, Necalli cannot safely activate this V trigger and make me worry about things.
Round two. Fight. G wins. Round one. Fight!
One benefit of fighting characters like Lucia and G who have relatively slow moves in neutral is that you get to do things like dash up stomp. If you space this dash perfectly, the opponent is never going to specifically think about the stomp. They're going to think, at least for a bit, oh, you were too far out, it's my turn. But you can use heavy stomp in particular in some very creative ways in footsies when your opponent thinks it's their time to do something. Creating your own fate, scramble if it's technically. And you know our advice when it comes to GV trigger. Just block the whole thing.
Round two. Fight! G wins. It's go time. Let's do this.
This is now a matchup we also know well, although it could have been changed if the president decided to use V skill 1 as use V skill 2 as V skill 1 doesn't necessarily help a ton in this matchup.
Fight!
Or rather, it's less effective when the Kareem player knows the Kareem side of the matchup. That said, the entire reason for writing notes is to make sure you remember, because a lot of these things don't come back to mind easily.
Not my day! Final round. Fight.
And there's our first origin, meaning that the matchup is probably about to change. While it is somewhat risky, the flow that Orochi adds to this from Karin's side means that G has to be on guard for more things, meaning he has to play more footsies, meaning he has to get into Karin's zone of influence, basically. Her specialization is in focusing these footsies, but G can counter at least some of it by facing that as his response when he has enough V meter activate and use that to change the way footsies is played as a whole. His longer moves then become something he can make safe at some cost. And this happens in a way where Karin cannot necessarily do things by causing the same effect on her side. This is also usually true because she spends a lot of the reversal to get this situation set up in the first place.
Round one. Fight.
But understanding at what point the Orochi comes in matters a lot as well, since a lot of the time it's more so about making G think too hard to stop Karin from getting to her correct space on screen. Without the Orochi, it's easy to keep Karin out by either respacing yourself or hitting certain buttons. Once Orochi comes into play, the move itself may not be all that threatening, but using it to unlock the ability to walk to the position that Karin likes helps a lot. Basically, G is less likely to intercept things and more likely to walk back and block rather than standing his ground, making it easier to push him to the corner.
Round two.
As with most characters though, our suggestion is neutral jump, and G is capable of doing this relatively effectively in this matchup. The range that G tends to stand at means that if he still has enough health, if he's far enough into the game, using his neutral jump will generally not result in him getting hit by the already difficult to execute long-range anti-air tangle.
Power to the earth! Light it up. Like that? Not my day!
These sorts of things come down to awareness though.
Final round.
Realizing, okay, the situation didn't end up the way I wanted it to. What do I have available to me? Do I have enough meter? Do I have enough V meter? What can I do here that changes my scenario again to something I like better? It's good therefore to not be too binary about things in terms of conversions of your feelings. If things didn't go the way you planned, but you felt as if you were doing so well, you probably were doing well, and there's probably some evidence left in your meters or your opponent's meters to indicate that you were doing well.
You win.
This is part of how people with particular skills keep their momentum. Because it helps them to think of all of the potential layers of their own offense or game plan. I was trying to get my opponent to the corner for 30 seconds and they just got out. There's no need to be discouraged just yet. If you were doing particularly well at that, chances are you've got enough meter to get them back to the other corner, probably faster than 30 seconds. Or maybe you don't have that capacity because your moves don't do that, but now your opponent is very little threat even if they manage to knock you down in neutral, which is something that you needed to get into the corner to avoid. Or even in Karin's case, the entire reason to push them there was so they couldn't do tricky jumps, but if Karin has enough meter, she doesn't care how tricky your jumps are. Those sorts of things are important to keep in mind when you are trying to flow and improve. If you're doing well at something and you can feel that you're doing well at it, there's a payoff somewhere. Especially if you've been doing well at it from the beginning of the round with very few breaks.
Round 2. Fight.
This is partially a meter watching level, and it comes up a lot in matches against G because he's a character where the relative positions of meters influences the match a lot more than most other characters.
Let's do this. Round 1. Fight.
tall characters still have that problem against Demon Flip. The concept of a taller character specifically having a slightly taller crouching hurtbox has always been a thing, and therefore probably just got kept. It is why certain fuzzy guard setups work on them. But, more importantly, there are moves that you might think are avoidable just by crouching that are technically only avoidable by crouching because the character actually has moved their hurtbox, meaning that for tall characters, Demon Flip becomes a stronger option. Now, this isn't to say that you can absolutely never grab a crouching character of regular height when Demon Flip is being used, but there's definitely some difference.
Looks like I won. Alright.
Final round. Fight.
This is starting to get pretty rhythmic though, because as mentioned, it's not really something that is easily resolved by the Alex player when the Akuma player is not stressed out.
Akuma wins.
What they can do is add stress to both sides of the matchup by playing a little more footsies, particularly with their stand medium kick. This is stressful for the Alex player and doesn't have a huge payoff, but the counter from Akuma's side is also stressful and doesn't have a huge payoff. So if you felt as if you were going to be able to handle the rest of the match, if you could just get your opponent a little bit more stressed than yourself, there's definitely some options with just hitting with the stand medium kick, forcing Akuma to use more projectiles and to try to dominate more once he does have advantage. But one other thing it really helps with is that if Alex can get at least a couple of pokes in, and therefore establish a life lead, it can passively increase an Akuma player's stress. This match is a very good study in winning more so by stressing your opponent than by any specific level of trickery. Because Alice is really just not that tricky a character. Even if you were using V-Trigger 2, it wouldn't be that stressful still, because Akuma can spend a lot of time crouching. He doesn't really need to fear the DDT that much.
Alex wins.
Advice going the other way, of course, is simple enough. Always play as if you're winning. Characters like Akuma, Lara, to some extent Falk, Seth, and really good Fang, and of course Urien. But there are a few matchups where this doesn't work for Urien, whereas everyone else is more or less guaranteed, let's say. Their power and conversions are explosive enough that if they did make the right call, you're going to lose a lot of health. And many of those characters have either so much damage or enough health of their own that if it's just a brawl, they'll win out. Alex therefore doesn't have to think too hard about how to do most of this. If he has the right level of flow in his movement. Once Akuma activates his V-trigger, Alex gets a small advantage. Specifically, now, Akuma can no longer use his light uppercut as a way of resolving a specific close-range problem without taking a much bigger risk than before.
Looks like I won. All right.
Round 2. Fight.
But unlike the most recent Nikali playlists, are much more set in that headspace than the Alex. Which of course then allows Sundir to remain calmer about everything that's going on, and once again, play as if he's already winning, no matter what health values you're seeing. Just assume that your character has an explosive enough output to win even without meter, because if you play decently you will get the meter somehow. It's only when you get down to the last sliver of life where you know your opponent can actually beat you in one move that you need to care about this. You can worry about trades and so on. And that is one disadvantage of having lower health characters. Trades are a bigger deal to you.
Akuma wins. Let's do this.
Based on the look of those ping bars, whatever it was might be from this side. If it turns out that we are the ones who've become laggy or there's any issues on stream, we're already at about 20 minutes before we normally end these. So we'll see what happens and might close it up if things get iffy. So don't expect the stream to restart if for any reason it drops, for example. Just assume it's over.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight! Akuma wins. Round one. Fight! Kali wins. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Akuma wins. It's go time. Let's do this. Round one. Fight!
All warmed up. Looks like I won. All right.
Round two. Fight!
through you.
Final round. Fight! You win! Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! You win! It's go time! Let's do this!
We are now going into our last on-stream match of the night. Lounge usually stays open a little longer, but tonight I'm getting the feeling it's not going to. Or at least if it does, it's not going to be for too long. So if you haven't joined yet, and you have any specific aims for anyone to play within the lounge, I expect that you're going to have to wait until next week.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! You win! Round one. Fight!
We still don't have all of the unclear changes. No, I will never get tired of that joke. Even though I'm told that's not how you're supposed to pronounce it. As much as it may hinder my commentary career, it will be unclear forevermore.
Round two. Fight!
All that was a lead up to the fact that we are probably still having Unclear Lounge tomorrow. And most likely getting back to Guilty Gear after that. Wednesday content, as always, undecided. Most likely not actually Sandbag Casuals, even though that's the thing that would go in the slot. So if we happen to be streaming, you should probably assume it's going to be Street Fighter V. But you should also primarily assume that there will be no Wednesday stream. Thursday will be Kame House, and Friday probably nothing, actually. Despite the fact that we have some more work to do on bots in this game, they're not likely to be done that soon. Even if they are, it wouldn't be too terrible because the worst that will happen is it will surprise you with functional bot, and a disc guidance will happen. But we're not likely to have any specifics for DOA or any other lounge on Friday either, which means we will see you Street Fighter fans next week, Monday, for another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge. The finalization of the things that will no longer be happening is not clear as yet. Tune in tomorrow to find that out. But this has been Iridian, along with the team 2MK, for another Mish-Mashing Lounge. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.